Okay. The speakers this semester are all locally derived talent. So many of them are grew up in Alfred or live in Alfred currently. And our first one, very happy to introduce Sophie Westacott, who is a PhD candidate at Yale. Unfortunately, she was hoping to be here in person, but the flooding yesterday prevented that from happening, but she's here thanks to Zoom. She obviously grew up in Alfred. She studied geology at Smith College and has had a variety of jobs in the field of paleontology. She's the daughter of Vicky and Emrys Westacott of Alfred, and she's doing some really interesting research on plankton and climate change. So she will be speaking to us. And what we will do is at the end, we'll ask for questions from the in-person audience and then from Zoom land. So I guess you can start, Sophie.
Cool. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And I am very sorry I couldn't come in person. It would have been a lot of fun to see you all. But luckily we've all figured out Zoom this year. So this is great. And today I'm going to talk to you about how plankton made of glass might have cooled Earth's climate. So a brief overview. First, I'm going to introduce you to a climate mystery that we don't currently have a solution for. Then I'm going to talk to you a bit about diatoms, which are kind of glass plankton, and they're very pretty. And then we're going to get into the fossil record of those diatoms and why it might not be what it seems like at face value. And then end with a hypothesis for the climate mystery as a sort of partial solution. So I want to start with this figure, which is it's pretty busy, but it's basically what the climate has looked like for the last 66 million years or so. So since the dinosaurs went extinct. So we've got, we're over here at this end, and then this is 66 million years ago, and we've got the temperature in degrees Celsius. And the part that we're used to seeing is this part, right? Which is sort of, here we have 1850 to the present. This is our post-industrial climate. And we can see that these RCP lines here, which is representative concentration pathways, these are the predictions for what the climate might be like in the future with different trajectories of what we do in terms of carbon dioxide and methane emissions. And then we have over here, we have 1,000 years before present. So this is kind of the zoomed in version of this end. And then this is the zoomed in version of that last little sliver here. So this is the ice core record in thousands of years before present. And you'll notice that the climate was going up, but it was only going up in a very small, sort of short-lived way. This is to do with Milankovitch cycles, and so astronomical tuning and things like that. But in the long term, when we look at the much longer record, we can see that this is actually a very cold time that we're living in. And what's particularly frightening when we look at these future trajectories is that some of these are reaching up into temperatures that we haven't seen for 40 million years. So by 2300, we could be looking at a climate state that hasn't existed on Earth for 40 million years. And all of human evolution happened in this very cold period. So we don't really know what that would look like, and the rate of change would be phenomenal. But when we back out and look at the millions of years timeline, we can see that also that there's been this gradual cooling trend over the last 50 million years. And that's something that we don't well understand. We understand about carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases and what's happening to the climate today, and that it's terrifying. But there are some nuances to past climate that we don't yet have a handle on. And one of them is this gradual cooling trend. And the reason why that's so surprising is because the Earth has a natural thermostat that acts as a negative feedback loop and keeps the climate in a very narrow range. So if you think about carbon dioxide, we know that it's a greenhouse gas, and it reflects, prevents heat from escaping into space and reflects back on the planet. And volcanoes are constantly putting out carbon dioxide, as well as humans at the moment, but volcanoes have been doing that for a lot longer. And for 4 billion years, they've been putting out carbon dioxide, and yet the Earth hasn't turned into a fireball, right? It hasn't gotten warmer and warmer and warmer. And we know from the geological record that there's liquid water on Earth, billions of years ago, that the Earth has been habitable for life and a fairly clement climate. So we've got some sort of natural thermostat that's maintaining the temperature within a very narrow range that's suitable for life on geologic timescales, and acting as a negative feedback loop and somehow removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, even as these volcanoes are putting it out. And that natural thermostat is known as the silicate weathering feedback. Okay, and so the way this works, we have our volcano over here, putting out carbon dioxide. And as we know, that makes the climate warmer. It also makes it wetter, more humid. The storm of the last couple of days has kind of is one indication of that. Tends to be the case that wetter areas get wetter, drier areas get drier, but overall you have a more humid world. Then carbon dioxide in mixing with water creates carbonic acid, so you also have acid rain. And the result of a warmer, rainier, more acidic atmosphere is that you have increased continental weathering. And weathering is just the breakdown of rock. So there's physical weathering where the rock breaks apart and is transported downstream. And there's chemical weathering where the minerals that make up the rock are dissolving into their constituent components. And you get both, but particularly chemical weathering, you get more of that with a warmer, wetter climate. So we have continental weathering. Here we have carbon dioxide, we have water, and we have calcium silicate. This is basically, if you had to average up the continental composition, the composition of the continents, this is kind of the average composition that you would get. And so when this breaks down, you get calcium and other cations going to the ocean. You get carbonic acid or CO2 going to the ocean as well, and you get silicon going into the ocean. And these can then rearrange themselves. These are dissolved components. They're split apart, and they can rearrange themselves to make new substances. And the calcium reacts with the carbonate to form, or coming from the carbon dioxide to form calcium carbonate or limestone. Limestone is familiar to Alfredians because it's what you see in the creek beds, the stuff with the fossils in, that's limestone. Now in the deep sea, it's actually formed by, it's formed through plankton. So you have these little plankton called coccolithophores or foraminifera, and they're taking up these individual components and expending energy to kind of speed up this process and make their shells out of calcium carbonate. And eventually these stack up and form something like the cliffs of Dover, which are made up of just trillions and trillions of these tiny, tiny plankton, making little tiny shells out of calcium carbonate. So that's limestone, and it captures that carbon, right? So the carbon dioxide that came out of the volcano is now in a rock, and it gets buried and removed from the ocean atmosphere system. And you're left over with silicon, and the silicon goes into silicon dioxide goes into this amorphous silica. And amorphous silica is basically just glass, which again should be familiar to everyone in Alfred. But in this case, again, there's these little plankton that make their skeletons out of glass. So they take up silicon, they take up oxygen, and then they construct these incredibly beautiful, elaborate little chandelier-like skeletons that are very pretty. So if you're a glass artist, you might have spent a decade learning how to do this, and these guys do it in a matter of hours to days, but don't feel too bad. So this is the silicate weathering feedback. We have elevated CO2, which leads to a hotter, wetter climate, increased weathering, which is increased input of silicon and cations like calcium to the oceans. That leads to increased burial of limestone and lowering of CO2. And this is a negative feedback loop. So when we're producing limestone and glass and silica and burying them in the bottom of the ocean, this is a very efficient thermostat. And it, again, maintains the temperature within this narrow range, very effective. So then we've got this mystery of how does the thermostat get overridden? Because here we have a gradual cooling over tens of millions of years. I shout out that the Silicate weathering feedback operates on timescales of hundreds of thousands of years to millions of years. So it's not a solution on its own for our current climate crisis, right? We can't just wait for this to happen. It will happen over, hundreds of thousands of years. And again, remember that humans kind of evolved in just a few million years. So waiting a few million years isn't really an option, can get us very far. But it will eventually happen, even to the carbon dioxide emissions that we're putting out now. But this process is still, now we have a process that's happening over tens of millions of years, this gradual cooling that's overriding that thermostat. How could that happen? And one idea is that the silicon, instead of getting buried as silica, gets incorporated into clays. Again, another rock Alfred should be familiar with. So here the calcium or other cations are interacting with aluminum and the silicon and some oxygen and hydrogen to form clays, and maybe some other components to form clays. Notice that there's no carbon in this formula. So instead of forming limestone, which includes the carbon and removes the carbon from the system, we're forming a clay and the carbon is just retained in the system. So there's no lowering of carbon dioxide. So if you have more clay formation and less limestone and glass formation, you're going to end up with a less efficient negative feedback. So if this one is the thermostat in your house, which is nice and efficient, you just bought it last year. This I like to think of as the office thermostat that never seems to work or do anything, and you kind of wonder why it's even there. That's the inefficient clay thermostat. Another way to think of this is you're leaving your windows open. So if you've left a big window open, your thermostat is going to try to keep up, but eventually the house is going to get colder and colder and colder. And for this picture, we have to kind of imagine not living in Alfred and imagine living somewhere with AC instead, because in this case, if we leave the windows open, it gets warmer. So if you have clay forming in this inefficient thermostat, then you have more CO2 in the atmosphere and a warmer world. And closing the window or reducing the clay formation is going to lead you to a cooler world, because you're going to have more efficient removal of carbon dioxide from the system. So more efficient CO2 removal accompanies less clay formation. Then we're left with this mystery of, okay, but why would there be less clay formation toward the present? What's changing over time that would make that the case? So one possibility is that there is less silica burial. So again, if we put the silicon in clay instead of in these plankton and sponges that make siliceous skeletons and bury the silica that way, perhaps that sort of frees up the silica to go into clay. And then we're left with the question, well, why would there be less silicon buried in the form of silica instead of clay? And here's where we get to the glass plankton called diatoms. So diatoms are microscopic algae. So they're photosynthetic. They're basically tiny plants. They make these little frustules or shells out of glass. And they're really tiny. We're talking like 20 microns, very small. They're also gorgeous. The Victorians actually used to collect these, and it was a kind of a courting ritual to like invite someone over to look through your microscope at the diatoms you'd collected. But today they're some of the most abundant plankton in the world. They actually make up 1/5 of all primary productivity on Earth. So they're incredibly important, and they're the base of many ecosystems in the ocean. Very important plankton. And they also pretty much control the silica cycle, because they take up so much silica that they're responsible for most of the silica burial in the deep sea. Now, the diatom fossil record seems pretty straightforward at face value. They evolved about 150 million years ago. We have molecular clock estimates to demonstrate that. And they seem to have been becoming more and more abundant and diverse ever since. So the fossil record looks something like this. Again, here we have age on the x-axis going towards the present this way. And over here we have diversity, which is a sort of estimate for abundance as well. And you can see it's been increasing toward the present. But there's a bit of a catch. You might think at this point, right, problem solved. So diatoms have been increasing, and so they're taking up all the silica, burying it as silica. It can't go into the clay. The thermostat's been getting more efficient, and that's it. Great, we're good. But diatoms, the diatom fossil record reflects both the abundance of the organisms as they're living, and also what happens to them after they die and after they're buried. So diatoms, they have their little, couple week lifespan at the surface of the ocean, and then they die. The shells split apart, and they start to dissolve as they sink through the ocean. And they dissolve even more as they are sitting in the mud on the seafloor and get kind of buried in the sediment. And so what you see in the fossil record is only a tiny fraction of the original living population, maybe less than 1%, maybe as much as 3%, but a very small fraction. And not only that, but the two main factors that are affecting the preservation of diatoms, i.e. whether they make it into the fossil record or not, are temperature and sedimentation rate, which is the rain of mud or sediment onto the seafloor. Basically, how quickly are they buried beneath things and kind of removed from contact with seawater, which helps them to dissolve faster. So as temperature increases, diatom preservation goes down. And as sedimentation rate increases, diatom preservation goes up. And this is particularly important because first, as we saw before, temperature has gone down over the last 50 million years. So here we have that in red. This is the temperature of the bottom of the ocean in degrees Celsius. And sedimentation rate, which is actually somewhat connected to temperature, has gone up, particularly in the last 5 to 10 million years. And so sedimentation rate here is in centimeters per 1,000 years, because it's a very slow rain of sediment to the deep sea. So what we did was take these records of temperature and sedimentation rate, collated over this whole time period and kind of a global estimate, and we put them through a diagenetic model, which is just a set of equations that are trying to estimate, based on environmental factors, what the preservation likelihood would be, what happens to particles once they're buried, in this case, diatoms. And what we're trying to get out here is what fraction of the diatoms that land on the seafloor would you expect to make it into the fossil record? And what we find is that there is a big change in the preservation of diatoms over this time. So here, you can kind of ignore this dissolution reaction rate constant, unless you're a chemist. But here we have the percent silicon preserved, again, the fraction being preserved out of the total. And here we have the age in millions of years, again, and we can see that the preservation in all three of these scenarios, these are just different, these kind of factor in variation in other variables that we don't have a very good understanding of. In all three of these scenarios, we see an increase towards the present in preservation of diatoms, particularly in the last 15 to 20 million years. What this means is that the diatom fossil record is probably reflecting a lot of this increased preservation rather than a change in the actual abundance of diatoms. And that the actual abundance of diatoms probably looks a lot flatter, maybe not quite as flat as this, but a lot flatter. It may have been much more constant through this time period. So what does that mean for clay and carbon dioxide? Well, if silica burial increased, then clay formation would have gone down. And if clay formation went down, then carbon dioxide levels would have gone down too. And we have some good evidence through the fossil record, but also through this preservation, the results of this modeling, that the silicon buried as silica seems to have gone up over time. And this creates a positive feedback loop because, again, it's temperature that's driving the change in diatom preservation. But the change in diatom preservation through clay, through the burial of silica as clay rather than silica, is changing the temperature. And so we're creating this positive feedback loop, which if you remember positive versus negative feedback loops, I'm really sorry to have a virus example here, but it was the one I could find. You get an increase over time, right? A directional change as opposed to a regulatory change. And so what we're seeing here is that something perhaps causes the climate to start to cool, and then that causes greater preservation of silica, less clay formation, and that causes the climate to continue to cool, and so it goes on like that. Now, this is probably not enough to explain the whole thing. In fact, it isn't. We don't know what would start that cooling trend to begin with, and there's probably not enough silica in the ocean to make this 15-degree difference in bottom water temperatures, this massive climatic difference. But it's a hypothesis for a partial solution. It's perhaps one part of the solution to this longstanding climate mystery. So I just want to sum up here. Oh, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Sum up here and say, okay, we've got kind of what we've gone over so far. We know there's a regulatory negative feedback that acts as a thermostat to keep the Earth habitable. And we know that that's somehow been overridden and caused this cooling climate trend over the last 65 million years. We know that we think that one possible reason for this could be that clay formation has gotten less over time. And that one possible reason clay formation could have gotten less would be that the silicon, instead of going into clay, is going into silica, sort of buried as glass. And then we've looked at the diatom fossil record and used diagenetic modeling to ask whether the diatom fossil record is accurate and reflects the sort of original abundance of diatoms, or whether it reflects preservation. And said it seems to reflect preservation, and that these preservational trends are themselves directed by temperature and sedimentation rate, which is also directed by temperature. And so our sort of summary hypothesis here is that changes in deep sea silica preservation produced by these declining temperatures and increasing sedimentation rates caused further cooling, and then that could in turn be part of the answer to the mystery of Cenozoic cooling. So with that, I'd like to thank my co-authors, Pincelli Hull, Mingyu Zhao, Noah Planowski. If you want to see all the equations and fiddly bits, we've just got the paper out, so check that out. Thanks to these funding sources, and thank you for having me, and thanks for listening. And with that, I'll take any questions.
All right, Sophie, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, we've been having trouble with the sound in here. I'm going to start with a question. I mean, first of all, that was fantastic. Does pH come into play at all?
Yeah, probably. But pH doesn't have a big effect on silicon. Like you can, it probably wouldn't matter that much for silica preservation. Where it might matter would be the clay formation. And it would matter for limestone preservation as well. So limestone is very sensitive to pH. But silica is really not sensitive except at very high pH.
Yeah, I was going to say a high pH, very high, you're going to dissolve the silica more, but we don't get into those ranges, that high pH range.
Yeah, you have to get to like 12 or 14 and just don't see it. Yeah, so I think clay formation would be where that would be most likely to matter, which we didn't model. So it's a good question.
As someone who has studied clay for most of her career, I'm very sad to see clay formation decreasing, but that's just my personal. So I'm going to open it up to questions from the room here first, and then we'll open it up to questions on Zoom. Any of the students here have a question they want to ask?
Do you think in the future these plankton could be used? And do you have any ideas of how they could really be used to help other places in the world?
Did you hear that, Sophie?
I didn't. Could you repeat it?
Yeah, can you speak a little louder?
Do you think the plankton could be almost not harvested, but grown or used so that they can be spread and potentially help cool down more parts of the planet at a greater capacity?
Yeah, so that's actually has been floated definitely as an idea for carbon capture, including things like seeding the ocean with nutrients to promote different plankton. Diatoms, in addition to the silicon, they also contain like the squishy bit, right? And they contain organic carbon inside the frustule. So when they sink down, you also get a burial of organic carbon. So there's kind of two ways that people have thought about, like, as far as I know, like using plankton to kind of sink carbon into the deep sea. One through organic carbon and like nutrient seeding, and one through inorganic carbon, which is the calcium carbonate plankton specifically. So yeah, that's definitely something people are interested in. Another, I guess another perhaps relevant carbon capture mechanism people are researching is trying to make that weathering thermostat more efficient or go into kind of hyperdrive. And the way they're talking, there are a bunch of ways people are talking about doing that, but some of the people I'm working with here, including this guy with the duck, Noah, the ways that they're interested in are include putting basalt, like volcanic rock in, laying it down in farms to increase weathering, because basalt weathering kind of is a faster way to, if you had more basalt weathering, it would speed up that weathering feedback. They're also trying to put it in the ocean, just like dump basalt in the ocean or dump basalt in the Congo or places where it's likely to weather quickly, and just try to increase that weathering process. But you'd also have to see it reflected in the deep sea burial portion, which gets tricky when, as Michelle mentioned, like when you have, for instance, pH changing and becoming harder for those calcifying plankton to calcify.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, now we'll open it up to questions from Zoom land, and why don't we try, let's see. All right, so Bill Miranda has a question on the chat. Maybe we'll start with that. Can you see the chat, Sophie?
Oh yeah. Okay, it says, would the rate of volcanic activity or rate of gases released from volcanism contribute to these changing conditions for survival and or fossilization? Ooh, yeah, good question. Yeah, so that is the flip side, right? Is that this whole thing assumes that the volcanic outgassing component is constant through time, and that might not be true. We know it's pretty constant. It seems to be pretty constant, or it's thought to be pretty constant through, all of geologic time, if we're thinking about like, or at least all of the time that life has been around, say for the last 500 million years. But you definitely get blips. You get moments where there's been very rapid outgassing and it's led to mass extinctions, or just periods where you seem to have more outgassing. And I guess the flip side to, I'll just go back to this diagram here. When this gets buried, when this limestone and silicon get buried in clay, they eventually are going to come back up. Some portion of them is going to go down into the mantle, into the deep earth, but some portion is going to come back up. And so there is, on these kind of very long time scales, like tens of millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, there's also going to be some kind of feedback in that direction. But it operates at such a different time scale that it's sort of tricky to, it's overlaying onto this. And we have a really poor understanding of how much the stuff that's buried gets out, comes back up, and how much of it goes down just into the center of the earth, how much it controls the outgassing rate, or what controls the outgassing rate. So yeah, that's a great question. The volcanic activity and rate of outgassing, we don't have a good handle on, and it certainly would change things. But the main thing with the weathering feedback is that no matter how much CO2 you put out, because the negative feedback is responsive to it, it should eventually equalize. It should eventually kind of deal with it. In terms of changing conditions for fossilization and survival, yeah, on the short time scale, it certainly could. If you had, for instance, warmer oceans, you'd have warmer or colder oceans are going to favor different kinds of plankton, and their preservation, the higher and lower temperatures are going to affect that. Yeah. Ooh, what if we were to dump crushed used glass in the ocean? Do you have some crushed used glass, for instance, that you're looking to dump? Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, it should work. Sea glass, like, we see sea glass and it's really worn out just over a short time. It's sort of physically weathered out over just decades. So yeah, used glass should also, I imagine, help. I think that's probably a smaller contingent of people who have a lot of it hanging around.
Speaking of which, that question from Alex, I mean, there's a lot of modeling done, conceptual computer modeling, but do they do physical modeling, like with, smaller scale tanks of ocean water and dumping glass, try to dump glass, things like that? Is that possible or is it just the ocean system so complex that it can't be modeled on a physical scale?
Yeah, no, they definitely do experiments. So they're doing experiments like these people I'm working with here at Yale are doing some experiments in the Long Island Sound and in Wisconsin orchards and some Connecticut orchards. And actually even they're in their own vegetable gardens of just scattering basalt and then measuring, sort of different things, how quickly it's weathering and what factors are making it weather faster. So yeah, there is definitely experiments going on, and there's a history of experimentation, but it's really ratcheted up in the last few years as carbon capture becomes more on people's mind. The IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, has said that it's not going to be enough for us to simply curb our carbon emissions. We are going to need to also remove carbon from the atmosphere, and so we are going to, we do need some technological solutions for that. So that's kind of, I think, driven a lot of the experimental work. Yeah.
Okay, there's another question in the chat there.
Yeah, if we promote plankton growth by seeding oceans, what could the increased carbon dioxide capacity from the atmosphere get to? That's a great question, and I don't know the answer, but I'd love to know. And I'm not sure if that's been modeled. It gets a little bit tricky because plankton, this is where people have to study plankton ecology. So for instance, with these diatoms, you might think if you just dump silicon in the ocean, it's crushed up glass, then they'll have a field day and there'll be a lot more of them. But then they run into iron limitations. And so then you have to dump iron. But if you dump iron, then perhaps it's some other plankton who thrives when there's like higher iron concentrations or things like that. So it gets pretty into the weeds of plankton physiology and ecology and really hard to predict. There are sort of large scale modeling of those, but you're kind of either in this large scale modeling world or you're in the granular empirical, very small scale world, and moving between them, we lose a lot, I think. Yeah, is there any other kind of plankton acting similar like diatoms? Similar as in like silica use? Definitely, yeah. The two main silica using planktons are diatoms and radiolarians. So actually these pictures of the glass ones, let's see, over here were radiolaria. This is a radiolarian up here, and then a diatom down here. And then sponges also use silica. They're not plankton, but they also use, they're glass sponges. The radiolarians are beautiful, and they're very similar to diatoms in their silica use, but there aren't as many of them, and they're not photosynthetic. They sometimes have symbionts, but they don't produce their own energy, and so they kind of they're in a different category of plankton, and they never took control of the silica cycle quite the way diatoms have. And diatoms have really, since they evolved, they really kind of became the dominant plankton in a huge way. Chert abundance is sometimes used as a proxy for rate of volcanism. Have you looked at how that is varied over time? Yeah, I have. Yeah, actually, I made a compilation of charts in the deep sea record through this time interval to look at how they might reflect the sort of changing silica burial. But there's also been charts sort of more globally and including near shore charts. Charts are just, by the way, for those who don't know, it's just also microcrystalline quartz. It's also silica, and it's what the diatoms and radiolarians become once they get buried really deep down and kind of undergo some pressure and temperature. They form a rock called chert. And as a proxy rate for volcanism, I haven't really looked at, but I've seen papers that do. I think Kidder was one in particular who looked at that. But that would be really interesting to compare perhaps the deep sea record with the shallow marine record of cherts. On one of the slides, you'd shown a wide array of specimens. Is each shape a different species, or are they individually unique like snowflakes? Each one is a different species, but, and I don't know this about diatoms, but for radiolarians, they can be weird even like within species. So if they have a kind of body plan, it's like, okay, they're going to be shaped, like a cone, and it's going to have 3 little legs, bits sticking out and a spike at the top. But then they can mix it up a lot. And part of the reason they can mix it up is because they're made of glass. They're constructed out of glass, and glass is it doesn't have any crystal lattice structure. It doesn't have, right? And so it's amorphous, which means they're able to do these things that they perhaps wouldn't be able to necessarily do if they're working within a crystalline structure. So actually here's some pictures of some radiolarians that I took using the SEM. And like, if you look at D, for instance, I mean, these guys are really weird. They make some really weird shapes. And even when it's like, okay, it's going to be spiky, they can often be a little bit wonky or off or, lopsided. That's pretty common.
Okay, do we have any other questions out in Zoom land? Okay, before I thank Sophie, personal shout out to, I think it's your Uncle Max, who I see there, who was an undergrad at Dartmouth when I was a grad student studying Earth Sciences, right?
Oh, no way.
I think so. Is that right, Max?
You there?
Well, maybe he's just pretending to be there. Anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah, no, that's me. Sorry, I didn't know I could speak, so I just sent a note, but that's so fun.
Yeah, Vicky told me that a few years ago. We figured out we were there at the same time. Okay, thank you, Sophie. That was a really great talk. It was a really great way to start the semester, start the series. Next week, we have Neil Van Dyne, who grew up in Wellsville. Locals may have known his father, who was a eye doctor there for many years, but Neil is a co-founder of Haiti Outreach, and he'll be talking about water and sanitation in Haiti. And some of you may remember that about 4 or 5 years ago, spearheaded by my Water Planet class, but also with a lot of help from the community, we raised enough money to put a well in one of the villages there. So he's going to talk to us a little bit about what's going on, not only with our well, but also other things having to do with water and sanitation in Haiti. In the meantime, though, thank you very much. I'm going to clap by the microphone here. And I suppose if anybody wants to stay on Zoom and keep talking to Sophie, that's great. We have to close it down in the lecture room here because there's a class coming in next, but people are free to stay on Zoom and talk. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. This is really fun.